So Joe Rogan is someone who's very interesting because he's sort of all over the place politically, depending on who his guest is. And on the Shapiro Sunday special, if you don't know, well, I did a video on this. He basically just went on a full liberal wave on Ben Shapiro, and Ben Shapiro kind of just smiled because I'm sure it was kind of awkward. But he goes, universal basic income, I think he said Medicare for all. He said I think he said universal health care. He said free college. Like, that's insanely left in the United States. If you believe that, you're pretty much on the edge of the left spectrum in the context of the United States, if you take out, people like Noam Chomsky out of the equation. So based on that and other things he said, you can sort of deduce that he's pretty left-wing. But it's sort of tough because I've also seen clips of him where he rants about the government and how the government, steals money and stuff like that. And then I've also seen Steven Crowder say that Joe Rogan says in public that he supports Bernie Sanders, but in closed doors he craps on him, which I honestly believe because it's like he's a really, really, really rich dude. At any time you're really, 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 really rich, like insanely rich, and the tax man comes for you, it's probably pretty tough. So I definitely believe Crowder when he says that. I don't know if you guys believe me. You can let me know about that down below. But he had a podcast, and he had a podcast with a few other guys on there. I think Brian Callen and a crazy guy, Eddie Bravo. Dude's insane, by the way. I don't know. I forgot if Brendan is on there or not, but they're going to talk about corruption and money in politics. And we're going to come back and talk about it because obviously it's a very interesting issue. Check it out.
But
Well, you gotta do that.
whenever I hear people talk too much about politics, even myself included, my own words, I'm like, you're talking about like a rigged game. It's like you're talking about pro wrestling.
Yeah.
It's like you're talking about something that's you're pretending that it's real.
But of course, the government is corrupt as fuck. But when you're talking about stuff like that, like are the elections rigged? Or do our votes count? The one thing that I learned from these midterms is that if your vote didn't count and it's all decided like pro wrestling, then there wouldn't be all this voter fraud and all these computers that can,
But voter fraud's not what I'm talking about.
So
Though. I'm not
Russia
talking about
wouldn't have to get
voting.
involved?
I'm talking about the way once you're in office, the way things get handled.
No,
and what's
I get it.
influenced.
No, I get it. But what I'm
That's
saying is,
rigged.
from the elections, you see that your votes do matter.
Yes.
There's a lot of corruption and fraud going on. But if it was all rigged like WWE, they wouldn't need to do all that. They were like,
No,
this
I-
guy's
I
gonna
would
win,
say
that
no.
guy's gonna.
You're
You
right.
still got to vote.
You're right
Yeah,
in
like, we
terms
don't
of
get
So
voting.
it's still
Yeah.
still the real system,
Right.
Because a lot of people think it's not a real system.
Right.
Like it doesn't matter. They already decide, and they're just going to put them in. No, the way they actually decide is they decide who they're going to rig the machines for.
Yes.
But the votes still count. You just got to make sure that there's no shenanigans going on.
The votes
right?
most certainly do count, but where it gets really squirrely, and this is where politics get goofy, is in why do politicians do what they do? Do they do what they do to support the people, or do they do what they do because special interest groups have influenced
Yeah, they get
them?
there's
There's way more of
Well,
that.
not only that, here's what's really wild. So Capitol Hill, when you're in Congress, they call that the farm team because in Capitol Hill you spend 6 years, 7 years. Let's just say you're a senator. Now, when you're a senator for, I don't know, 10 years, when you're on Capitol Hill as a congressman for 10 years, you develop real connections and relationships with government officials who make decisions. You also understand how government works. You understand who's actually influencing who. So now what do? So let's say you lose an election, or let's say you decide, I made my 160 grand a year, can't really live on that money. You go to K Street, you join a lobbying firm. And because you've been there for 6 or 9 or 10 years, you know a lot of people. And that lobbying firm goes, hey, we'll pay you $1 million now. And all you got to do is drive to Capitol Hill every day, get in there and influence, use your connections so that we can get what we want from government. So corporations hiring lobbying firms to lobby for their bottom line. So now you're working to influence government. And the problem is when you're in Congress, you know that. You know you have a job waiting if you can make great connections. And now Washington becomes an economy of influence.
That's the game, right?
Yes. I'm fucking. You got to have Lawrence Lessig on your goddamn podcast. He can explain. He's a Harvard professor. That motherfucker.
Yeah, you keep telling me about the podcast you did with him.
He'll break it down. I did listen to that. I sent it to you. I think
Yeah.
it's Lawrence Lessig. He breaks it down. He wrote a book called Republic Lost, and he's got a couple TED talks.
On
but
how
that dude,
politics work?
Yes, and basically he said your government doesn't represent you, and here's why. Here's how it works. When he breaks it down, you go. It's simple the way he breaks it down because he's a constitutional scholar out of Harvard. But you're like, fuck. And what he said was fascinating. He said, Washington's a place where even if you're a good person, you must behave in a corrupt manner if you want to survive.
All right, so Lawrence Lessig, who was brought up by Brian Callen, he was someone who ran, I believe, in 2016, and I can't recall if he ran as a Democrat or not. But I remember Cenk Uygur supported him. He's someone who is trying to get money out of politics. And money out of politics is a huge problem. Now, I was surprised that the crazy guy, Eddie Bravo, actually said that your vote does matter. Because someone who has the crazy things that he says, like I think he thinks the earth is flat or some dumb crap like that. Like, dude, if you think the earth is flat in 2018, you're probably the dumbest person to ever live. But he said that your vote does matter. I was genuinely surprised he said that. I didn't expect him to say that. I really honestly didn't. I did not expect Eddie to say that at all. Your vote does matter, but there are certain systemic biases, of course, especially against third parties, etc., etc. And we saw what happened through the DNC back in 2016. But they got into an interesting conversation here about money in politics. Yeah, as Lessig said, as quoted by Callen, is that yes, your the Congress does not represent you. It simply doesn't represent you. And we are effectively living in an oligarchy because despite the whole purpose of A, having a representative government and B, having, legislature that is voted by the people, which is the same thing, I'm just being redundant here, is they represent you. You vote said person in office, and then they vote based on the will of you, what you want. That's the whole point of a representative government. That's the whole point. Otherwise, it's not really representative, right? So, no, they're not. And, what's the evidence for that? I mean, there's so many different things. Remember the internet privacy bill. Remember net neutrality. Remember all the stuff that the NRA is blocking. It's ridiculous, okay? Our politicians do not represent us even in the slightest. In fact, even the positions like Medicare for All and other things like that have insanely high polling numbers where I think it's a majority of people in the United States support Medicare for All, which is insane because if we were a representative democracy, what that would mean is our representation would that's what they would vote for and that's what they would propose and that's what they would vote, but they don't. And that's because of the corporate lobbyists and all the corporations that donate to them, and so they become beholden to their donors. Now, what's super interesting about this is there are some differences in this that we need to start talking about. And so, generally speaking, whenever we talk about the issue of money in politics, what's the first thing that immediately pops in your head, right? Citizens United. Absolutely, that's the first thing. We need to overturn Citizens United. And I agree with that. But is that it? Is that it? Would that actually stop corruption? Now, the case of Citizens United is a really crazy one. It's basically like, can a PAC put out some kind of a documentary in a certain span before the election? So it's not even the campaign itself. It's like a separate PAC, a political action committee. Can they put out like a documentary in said time frame between the election? And so Congress voted, yes, they can. A PAC, by the way, a PAC, not just like you sitting over there who supports said person can't put a documentary out on YouTube, you're going to get stifled. No, that's not how that would be. So yeah, we do need to overturn that, of course. But is that the core issue? No, not even close. And the money in politics debacle has been a thing that's been going on for a long time in the United States. And so we need to expand our dialogue about money in politics further to shift the Overton window even further, because just the talk about overturning overturning Citizens United, that's not enough. That's not even close to enough. In fact, if we do that, it really doesn't solve much at all, period. But here's the thing. There was this case back in 1976 called Buckley versus Vallejo, and that is probably the core issue, and that was that the campaign itself can spend as much money as it wants on its own campaign. So there's a thing that is a problem, which is that is it really a fair election if a campaign is to be able to spend unlimited amounts of money? Is that legitimately a fair and free democracy? Because you've essentially got more speech than someone, and the grounds of this was the First Amendment. Now, some of the solutions to this, the best way I think to have an actual fair and free election, there are two things we need to do. One of the both of them they mentioned there, Brian mentioned there. One of them being that I think Rogan had this idea that he presented, which was that you give everyone a certain amount that they can donate, and then they can donate it to whoever they want. Every person in the United States can donate it to whoever they want, but there's like a certain cap number that everyone can donate, because then that actually makes it fair. And so it's actually representing the will of the people, because if you do that, and oh, by the way, let me say corporations aren't people, by the way, but so corporations can't, and super PACs can't just donate a crap ton of money, because if you do that, they have more speech than you do, and what effectively is going to happen is the Congress is not going to represent you. You're not going to be represented by Congress. Congress is no longer representing you. They're representing special interests. That's why, despite polling data being massively progressive, we don't see shit being massively progressive. Nothing massively progressive. And that is the main issue that is at hand here. And so that's one of the things. Richard Ojeda has something that's kind of interesting too, which is that, and he has this on his website, is that it was something to the effect of after a certain amount of net worth, after being outside of government, you have to give that up to, I believe he said, charity. That's a good idea too, because the point brought up by Brian Callen as well there was, people who are representatives afterwards turn into lobbyists and make crap loads of money. And they can make more money than they did as congressional members, because as congressional members, you make your like 100 or whatever thousand a year. But you can make a lot more as a lobbyist. And a good example of this was, remember John Boehner, where he just randomly turned into, it was a position that was totally opposite to what he had as a member of Congress, funny enough. And all of a sudden just turns around. Now he's a lobbyist for them. That's quite interesting. I wonder why he did that. It's obviously for cash. And so that is part of the problem. And I think Ojeda's idea is pretty good. I mean, you effectively make it so that you don't have people going into Congress, getting these connections, and then coming out of Congress and going and being lobbyists and being rich as hell. Meanwhile, they didn't represent the people because they're trying to get these connections, and there's this huge money in politics corruption problem. And so I wanted to talk about this because there is a need for the Overton window to be shifted even more in terms of talking about this, because mainly, like I said, I know that as soon as I say money in politics and I go, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? For me, and I'm sure you guys too, immediately, Citizens United, right? But dude, that's barely it. Like, that's not even close to the whole issue. That's not even close. Not even close. If we overturn that, it'll be cool, but it's not going to do all that much. And so we have a lot of other issues to deal with because of the deep history of money and politics in the United States. So they talked about this. It was an interesting conversation, and Joe Rogan at least ostensibly supports getting money out of politics, which is an agreement with Cenk Uygur and his position on that. So that is something that's very interesting. A lot of times, and as we looked at a couple days ago, Joe Rogan's audience doesn't take too fond to him taking left-wing positions. So that's pretty interesting as well.